You should be able to see the text of Rambam, Hilchot Teshuvah, Perek Shalishi. Let us go back a moment, backpedal for a moment. Halacha Yod Daled or Waw. Rambam, as you recall, says, وَأَلُوا شَأَنْ لَهَمْ حَلَكْ لَعُلَمْ هَبَى. In other words, this discussion, this perek began with a discussion of how every person has zuchuyot and awonot, and Rambam spoke about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippurim. And in Halacha Yod Gimel, as you can see here, Rambam says, Habenonim, which is most people. In other words, people who are not either just purely good or purely evil. Awonot shelahem, אם היה בכלל מחסה עבונות שלהם שלא הניח תפילין מעולם דנים אותו כפי התאה ויש לו חלק לעולם הבא. This is how the discussion of עולם הבא begins in this perek. That's the context initially. וכן, כל הרשעים שעוונותיהם מרובים דנים אותם כפי התותיהם. All those who are evil, that is to say, they transgress the Torah, they are judged according to their sins. This is true for all Jews, with certain exceptions, as we shall see. This is, of course, explicitly stated in the Mishneh and Sanhedrin. All Am Yisrael have a helek l'olam haba, as do Rambam adds here, v'chen hasideh umot ha'olam yesh lehem helek l'olam haba. Very well. And then Rambam goes on to say that there are exceptions. وَأَلُوا شَأَنْ لَهَمْ حَلَكْ عُلَمْ هَبَى أَلَا نِخْرَثِيم وَأَوْفَذِيم. This is in Halacha Yod Daled. There are those who have no Halak Olam Haba, and they leave this world, they die, and they are cut off from the Jewish people in the spiritual realm as well. مُنِذُونِيم عَلْ قَدْرِ رِشْعَمْ وَحَتَّثَامْ لَعُلَامْ وَلَعُلَامِ عُلَمِيم. And they are judged for all time. And the list is as follows. Haminim, we discussed, Apikorisim, Hakofarim Batorah, Hakofarim B'tchiyat HaMetim, Hakofarim B'viyat HaGoel, Hameshumodim. So now let's finish the list first. Hameshumodim, Umahti'eh Harabim, Haporashim Midarchet Sibur, והעושה עבירות ביד רמה בפרהסיה כהויקים והמוסרים ומטילה אימה על הציבור שלא לשם שמיים. Now if we refer back for a moment to our earlier discussion, take for example the head of the legal mafia, which has taken control of this country. The heads and many of the people involved, so it's not just a handful of people, fit into many of these categories. Minim, Apikorosim, Koforim Batorah, Koforim B'tchiyat HaMetim, Meshumadim, Mahti'eh Harabim, that's particularly relevant to these people. Porashim Midarchet Sibur Umosarim Umatila Emal Sibur Shol Hashem Shemayim. All of these things apply very precisely and without any exaggeration to these people. And it's important to be aware of this fact and to stress it even, as I am now doing, because it is not frequently enough mentioned. So we covered some of these categories. And let us now return to Halacha Kaf Beth, which states as follows, or Yod Beth, Shanaim Hem HaMusarim. There is a concept, a halachic concept, a purely halachic concept. It appears in all halachic handbooks and codes, such as the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch. Wherever you look, you will find this. in Yora De'ah, Siman Kof Non Het, as I recall, in Hoshen Mishpat, Siman Tal Kaf He, at the end of Hoshen Mishpat. All these things are mentioned explicitly. Shanaim Hem Hamoserim, Hamoser Havero, Biyad Goyim, Lehorgo, or Lehakotho. As I mentioned before, the order of the Bagatz, of the Israeli High Court, to allow the Amalekim to come up right against the fence and not allowing the army to respond to fire upon them, that itself is an act of Masirah, clearly, without going any further. The number of cases, of course, is legion. Hamoser Havero Biyad Goyim, he, a Jew, who hands over a fellow Jew to non-Jews. It doesn't matter whether it's a government or a bunch of underworld characters. It doesn't matter. A Jew who hands over a fellow Jew into the hands of Gentiles, whose intention is to harm this Jew, either to kill him or to beat him up or what have you. So in other words, they intend to harm his body. The other category, or he who deliberately hands over the money, the property of a fellow Jew into the hands of, again, goyim, who wish to steal his money and take his property, or biyad anas, or into the hands of a Jew who is referred to as anas, that is to say, a violent criminal underworld type, shehu kiroi, who is considered a goy. Maybe this even is in some way a response to what you mentioned earlier, Leon. In other words, certain Jews receive the status of the worst of the goyim. Shenehem en lahem halak l'olam haba. This is a very serious matter. I remember Rav Tzvi Lakuk Zetzal. He mentioned in some of his talks, which were later published under the title Hilchot Rav Tzvi Yehuda, he mentioned the case during the Cantonist years in Tsarist Russia. Not quite the same kind of Gezerat Giyus, to quote Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef and others that we're discussing perhaps today in Israel, but something rather different. Sending off 12-year-olds for 25 years to the Russian army with the express intention, apart from boosting the numbers of the Russian army, to turn them into goyim l'chol davar v'inyan, for all purposes. In other words, it was a direct policy to rid themselves of their Jewish problems, so to speak. So at that time, many young Jewish lads were hidden by people, and there was a system. There were various ways, including paying bribes, to save a young Jewish boy from being sent off to the Russian army for 25 years. On the other hand, there were also people who saw this as a business opportunity, because as such things always go, if a person were to inform about a Jewish family that was hiding their young son, or they transferred him to a non-Jewish family secretly, and it's being presented that he is a son of this non-Jewish family, so that the Russian authorities will not know that he exists or will not get to him. Anyone who would inform about such a thing would be paid handsomely, and that's exactly what happened. And unfortunately, there were cases. I don't know how many. There were cases where some Jews chose that path and became Muslim. So Rav Tzvi told the story about a certain Jew at that time in Russia, who ostensibly, outwardly, was very, very frum, very, very religious, very pedantic about Kiyum Mitzvot. He used to wear 2 pairs of tefillin, and he shackled a great deal during Shmoneh Esrei, etc., etc. But it became known that he was a Moser. He was informing on Jewish boys and Jewish families, and sometimes it wasn't just the boy who would be caught up in their dragnet and sent to the army. The whole family might be sent to Siberia. And we know what happened most of the time when you were sent to Siberia. So it became known, and people went to the Rav of the town, wherever it was, and they told him. And it was decided that he has to be gotten rid of. And that's what they did. In the middle of Shmoneh Esrei one day, he was grabbed by a few people, placed inside a huge sack, which was then tied and shut, sealed, and he was tossed into the local nearest river. Rambam's not discussing here what you do with such people. Here he's talking about Olam Haba. But the Rambam did discuss the status of such people elsewhere, in terms of how we deal with them. And in all cases, we're discussing actually an act of self-defense. All such cases, whether it's Meshumadim or Musirim or Minim, what have you, it's always an act of self-defense. The Jewish people have the right and the duty to defend themselves. All right, so we have another category which now follows, which is Gimel or Yod Gimel. Yes.
How does this halakha? What role does this halakha play in situations where the Jewish community often can't enforce its own laws? So if there's a Jewish community in Galuth that the non-Jewish government doesn't allow it to prosecute its own criminals, then there has to be some interplay between the Jewish leadership and the non-Jewish government. So
right.
How does that work?
Well, that's a good question, but it's also not a new question. It's something which has existed probably almost from time immemorial. Depending on the circumstances and the seriousness of what this person is doing, how many people, in which way he's harming people, it is sometimes the correct and necessary thing to do to turn to the authorities and have them deal with him. The Rambam writes in Hoshen Mishpat that a Jew who engages in counterfeiting money, which is a capital offense in many cases, and of course if a Jew was caught doing this, it was very possible and even likely that the Jewish community would be punished as well, would suffer, not just the individual. So the Rama writes, based on certain sources, that a Jew who is known to engage in counterfeiting money, which will then cause great disrepute and damage and retribution vis-a-vis the Jewish community, he may be handed over to the non-Jewish authorities, for example. Ideally, the Jewish people, if they're living in a situation of galuth, under a non-Jewish authority, ideally they should have legal autonomy and have their own system of batei din, etc. And that was the case in most of the world till about 250 odd years ago, or something like that. And that's really when Jewish society began to come apart at the seams. In other words, the community used to be a very powerful institution that could enforce its will. There were places and times in history, several centuries ago, where the Jews were so autonomous they could even execute people in certain extreme cases. That is obviously a vastly better situation than one where the Jews have no control over their communal affairs, and no legal authority. And that immediately led to the dissolution of Jewish communities throughout Europe, for example. This is intimately connected to the movement of Jews from Jewish society to non-Jewish society, or wishing to live in both worlds. And therefore, this has everything to do with Reform Judaism and other movements and other schools of thought that grew up within the Jewish world. So, Halakha Kaf Gimel or Yod Gimel. Rambam states, "Notile ema ala sibur shelo l'shem shamayim." In other words, we're talking about a person literally who terrorizes his fellow Jews. He's not a meshumad. He doesn't transgress any specific halakha or mitzvah. He believes in the Torah, etc., etc. But what does he do? Zeh harodha sibur b'chazka. He who rules over the sibur, wields power, and violent power over the sibur, over the Jewish community or the Jewish people. Wehem yireim ufohadim mimenu harbe. If this doesn't describe the current Israeli Supreme Court, I do not know what does. Again, very appropriate. In other words, their intention is always self-interest. Lo lichvod shamayim. They do not do this in order to strengthen, to bolster the rule of Torah in Jewish society, because then the king is allowed to do various things. In extreme circumstances, the king is allowed to execute certain kinds of criminals or certain kinds of people when the situation in society is deteriorating, and the Batei Adin cannot deal with it and are not in a position to put a stop to these things. So people can be executed shalom min hadin, not extrajudiciary, in extrajudicial fashion. In other words, a Jew who acts like Malchei HaGoyim, that is to say, who makes up the rules as he goes, and who is beyond the rule of law himself, again, completely and precisely describing the judicial junta, as described by former President Reuven Rivlin about 20 plus years ago, in an interview with the Haaretz, with the Haaretz newspaper, which I have on my computer, and that's how he, in his words, describes the legal establishment in Israel. So such people, enem halak olam haba. Rambam isn't discussing how we deal with such people. Here Rambam is discussing olam haba, whether a certain Jew has or does not have a halak olam haba. In other words, whether this person maintains or loses their connection to the Jewish people, what we can refer to as Kolal Yisrael in the overarching historical and spiritual sense. Rambam continues and he says, Kaf Daled or Yod Daled, Kol Ehad wa Ehad, mi'arba'a wa 20 anashim elu shemaninu. Every one of these 24 categories that we just mentioned. So all the various types that we mentioned, the minim and the apikodosim and the kofrim b'Torah and the musarim, all of these categories. Afal pi shehen Yisrael, even though they are Jews, afal pi shehen Yisrael, and lahem halak l'olam haba. Nevertheless, and this is a chidush, as it were. In other words, the statement of the Mishneh, which Rambam quoted earlier in this perek, shekol Yisrael yesh lahem halak l'olam haba, is not the chidush. The chidush is that there are those who do not. And that's what Rambam stresses here again. As the Mishnah also says, وَإِلُوا شَأِنْ لَهِمْ أَفَلْ پِي شَأْنْ يِسْرَائِيل أَنْ لَهِمْ حَلَكْ لَعُلَمْ هَذَا وَيَشْ عَفِرَوْث كَلَوْث مِئَلُوا. And there are other less serious transgressions, sins. وَأَفْعَلْ پِي خَيْنْ. And nevertheless, أَمَرُوا حَخَمِيم شَهَرَغِيل بَهَمْ أَنْ لَحَلَكْ لَعُلَمْ هَذَا كَذَا لِتْرَحَكْ مِهَنْ وَلِيزَهَرْ مِهَنْ. Now there are other actions and transgressions that a Jew might commit, regarding which the Chachamim stated that he who does such and such en lo helek l'olam haba, has no helek l'olam haba. But Rambam here actually is telling you explicitly, if you know how to understand and read between the words and the lines, Rambam is telling you that Hazal were engaging in a act of educational psychology and threatening people with no helek l'olam haba, even though it's not technically speaking true. As Rambam says, "Kadeli trahek mehen ulehizaher mehen," in order to cause people to understand the seriousness of these things and not to act in those ways. So, in other words, this is a very important statement. There are various statements of Chazal, as Rambam is about to mention, where some people might read what Chazal say and might take it literally and think, well, if I do this or that person does that, eno helek l'olam haba. But that's not true. Those who do not have a helek l'olam haba are only those 24 categories that we mentioned before, which are all extremely serious and objectively pernicious actions and positions and beliefs, as I said before, regarding which the Jewish people have the right and the obligation to defend themselves. Here, we're not talking about such a thing, as we're about to see. These following categories, which are midivrei soferim, so that's what Rambam is saying. Till now, it's as it were minat Torah. In other words, it's absolute. These things I'm about to tell you, says Rambam, are midivrei soferim in the sense, not that the soferim, the Chachamim, are in any way responsible or have the authority to hand out or withdraw olam haba from someone, but rather they were threatening people with dire consequences in order to shake them up. That's what Rambam is saying. Afal pi chen amaru hachamim sharagin bahem en halak olam haba kadei litrahek mehem uleizaher mehem. And so these following categories are as follows: halacha kafeh wa elohen hamchana et havero, he who gives some kind of moniker or nickname to a fellow Jew, which is not respectful and causes this other person pain and causes other people to ridicule this individual. So this is all really connected in many ways to what we're about to see in a moment. Hamal bin paneh havero barabim, he who deliberately embarrasses his fellow Jew in front of others. So we have hammechanet havero. So that's and Rambam also said that a person who is raghil bahen, in other words, a person who does this habitually. A person might slip up once or twice in this or that way, but being raghil, doing something regularly, is quite different. We'eluhen hammechanet havero uhakoreh havero bechinui, which is similar. He calls out to him in a manner which is insulting or by some kind of nickname. Malbin paneh havero barabim, he who deliberately embarrasses his fellow Jew in front of others. Mitkabed biklon havero, and he who attempts to gain and, as it were, score points with regards to his fellow Jew who something untoward or unpleasant happened to, and he rejoices in this fact. And he who is mevazeh, which means to disparage Talmidei Chachamim, because a Jew who does that is obviously essentially disparaging the Torah. And he who does the same with regards to his own Rabbanim, his teachers. This is already mentioned in the Mishneh Masechet Avot. These last two things are mentioned in the Mishnah, and Amavazat HaMu'adhoth, for example, refers to someone who, the Mu'id, of course, refers to Holosh al-Mu'id. So because it's not a Yom Tov, and Minat Torah Melacha is Mutar, some people may adopt the position that Hol HaMu'id is just another Yom Hol, and there's no need to behave differently from any other day of the year, and therefore it's not necessary to have special meals, or to dress in a certain way, or to refrain from melacha, etc., etc. These things are hamavazayat hamu'adhoth. And such a person, eno halak lo mahaba, or at least Chazal use that terminology, and that directed that threat at people because they saw there were many people who behaved in this way. So this also tells you that the romantic idea that some people have, that in the time of Hazal, whatever that period of time people imagine that refers to, because it's a period of at least 800 years or something, but at any rate, there were many Jews out there who were not acting correctly in various ways. So if the Mishnah finds it necessary to mention Bizui Mu'adhoth, this is not because one or two people did this, it's because there were unfortunately many people who did this. And it's a serious matter, and that's why Chazal used this extreme language, that such people have no Chalak Lamaba. And Amaharel Takodashim, and he who disrespects and acts improperly with regards to Korbanot, or the meat from Korbanot, etc. Rambam continues and states, Halacha Kafwa, Bameh Devarim Amurim. This, all of what we discussed in this chapter, or the last part of the chapter at least, Shekol Echad Me'elu En No Helek Olam Haba. This is true, that these people have no Helek Olam Haba, B'Shemet V'lo Teshuvah. This refers to a person who fitted one of these categories, or many of them, like Yitzhak Amith, or Aaron Barak, or many other individuals who for now shall remain nameless. But we're not talking about a very small number of people, I'm afraid to say. I actually heard yesterday, there's a person in Israel that some of you may have heard of. His name is Eliyahu Yossian. He was actually born in Iran, and a very intelligent and knowledgeable individual. He's not frum, but he is very respectful of Jewish tradition and very nationalistic, and very importantly, he is completely, shall we say, non-liberal. In other words, he understands the inner contradiction and impossibility of being a Jewish nationalist and an extreme liberal. So I heard him mention recently that he knows these things, and he looks into such matters. He said that some of you also may have heard another one of these Meshumadim and Musarim, Matila Emal Athibur, Yair Golan. You may have heard of his name as well. Incredibly, a former Deputy Chief of Staff of the Israeli Army, which is really all you need to know about such things. And you probably heard what he said the day before yesterday. And so Yossian said that, which is clear to anybody, really, everyone understands this. This was a deliberate, these statements that this individual uttered were deliberate was a deliberate political move to gain support from the far left, which means, and that's clear, if he thought that it would harm him politically, then he wouldn't have said these things. That stands to reason. So obviously he thinks it does help strengthen his position. Not with the majority of the Israeli electorate, but with a certain section. So how many of such people are there? How large is this part of the Israeli electorate? Yossian, I heard it say yesterday, claims that it's 20%. For many years I've been saying 15%. That was my semi-educated guess. He said he analyzed this based on the statistics, that official government statistics about various aspects of Israeli society, that the Israeli, what's it called, the Lishkat Statistika, the statistics office or something, publishes annually. His claim, and I assume that he knows more than I know about these things, and I never really tried to quantify it. He did. He said it's 20%. All right, so 20% is not a majority, but 20% is not, neither is it an insignificant minority. So we're talking about a lot of people, very, very evil people, who have brought untold disaster and calamity and destruction on the Jewish people, both spiritually and physically. So Rambam says that any such person who fits any of these categories has no halak l'olam haba, v'shemeth b'lo teshuvah, assuming that this person left this world before doing teshuvah. Aval im shav mirish'o, if a person, when still alive, did teshuvah, he repented, and he retracted what he said, and he changed his tune and his actions, umeth v'hu ba'al teshuvah, and then died when he was in that new state of being about teshuvah, harei zeh mibnei ha'olam haba. Such a person will have a portion in the world to come. She'en lach davar she'omed bifnei teshuvah. Nothing stands in the way of teshuvah. Teshuvah conquers all. Afilu kafar ba'ikar kol yamao, even if a person was a complete atheist all his days. Afilu kafar ba'ikar kol yamao, uvaharona shav, and towards the end of his life he repented and he changed his opinions and his beliefs. Yesh lo halak l'olam haba, such a person will have a halak l'olam haba. Shneimar shalom shalom l'rahok v'laqarov amar Adonai u'lefathiu. In other words, the pasuk is referring to peace would be upon a person l'rahok v'laqarov. Chazal explained, he who was rahok and now has become karov, he who was far away, very distant, and now has come close. However, there is a caveat to this very important statement that we just heard now, that Teshuvah conquers all, and that is, Rambam says, Kol harashaim v'haposhaim v'hameshumadim v'chayotze bahem shehazor b'teshuvah. All such people, even the worst of them, if they truly did Teshuvah, and that's the case, that's the question, did they in fact do Teshuvah? Ben bagalui, ben shehazaru b'matmoniyot, whether they do Teshuvah openly and publicly so that we all become aware of it, and we know that this person is now a different person, or whether they did it b'matmoniyot, in other words, behind closed doors, in secret. Mekabalim otham. What does that mean? Shneimar shuvu vanim shovavim. Af al pish adayin shovavhu, even though he is still wayward. Sharei baseter bilevad hozer v'lo bagalui, because a person who repents and changes his ways only in secret, not publicly, he is still a shovav. In other words, he's still not acting properly at all. If he was truly dedicated and now of a different mind and heart altogether, he would be open and say this openly and plainly. Sharei baseter bilevad hozer v'lo bagalui mekabalim otho b'teshuvah. Now this statement, so what does that mean, mekablim otho b'teshuvah? This refers to Hashem being mekabel otho b'teshuvah. And some people, of course, see such a statement in Rambam, and either because they lack bikiyuth, lack general knowledge of what other things that Rambam and Chazal say, or because it fits their agenda, which is usually the case. That's the first and most important consideration. Does something fit my agenda or not? So some people say, well, you see, this person, he did such and such, he said such and such, so now we have to believe and assume that he is righteous and he has completely mended his ways. But unfortunately, that is not what it says here. What this refers to is mekabalim otho b'teshuvah, means bet din shel ma'ala. In other words, Hashem accepts such a person, even if this person is still not coming out cleanly, not coming out of the closet, so to speak, not stating openly, I've changed my ways, I was wrong, the things that I said I retract, I am distraught at what I did, etc. Even he hasn't said any of these things, but in his heart he's changed his mind and his ways and his actions as well. Of course, it's not enough to say, well, I changed my mind, but not my actions. If a person does this, even if it's not public knowledge, מקבלים אותו בתשובה means בבית דין של מעלה. It's true that it might have been clearer and less ambiguous had Rambam written Hashem, Makom, Kodesh Baruch Hu mekabel oto b'tshuva, or something like that. But Rambam didn't write that. Rambam wrote mekabelim oto b'tshuva, which refers only, however, to Hashem, not to how we relate to such a person. Now, this statement is clear. What I'm about to show you how we know this. First of all, it's obvious for the simple reason that if a person repents, changes their ways, their mind, privately or behind closed doors, then how are we to know this? So to claim that this applies in all such cases is irrational. Second of all, if a person, even if he openly and publicly claims that he has changed his ways, how are we to know that we can trust this person, that he's reliable, that what he's saying now is not dissembling once again, that he's not deliberately presenting something false for us to see, so that we will decide to do something or to relate to him in a certain way. And how do we know this? Rambam says explicitly in Hilchot Avodah Zarah, Perek Beth, which you should be able to see now. Rambam here says in Perek Beth, Hilchot Avodah Zarah, Hilchot HaGoyim, Halacha Heth or Hey, at the top of the page, Yisrael she'avad Avodah Zarah, a Jew who is known to have been a worshipper of Avodah Zarah. Harei hu keroy lechol davar, he is to be considered a Gentile. Lechol davar. This again may relate to what you mentioned earlier, Leon, with regards to saying Yimach Shemo v'zichro, etc. Harei keroy lechol davar, ve'enoki Yisrael she'avar al avera sheyesh ba sekhila. He's not even considered like a Jew who is Jewish, but sinned in with regards to a certain serious aspect of the Torah. Shall we say he was Mahalel Shabbat. So he's Hayav Sekila, but Yesh Lo Chalek Olam Haba. That's what we find in Masechet Sanhedrin. All those who are executed by the Beit Din for a specific sin, not for a general attitude or general dismissing of and disparaging of the Torah and lack of general belief, but a specific action. A person committed adultery, shall I say, with a married woman. So the Avirah is very great. The punishment is also very severe. But this person is a Jew and has a Halak Olam Haba. If a Jew is known to be a worshipper of Avodah Zarah, הרי הוא ככל לכל דבר, ואינו כישראל שעבר על עבירה שיש בה סקילה. ומשומד לעבודה זרה, הרי הוא משומד לכל התורה כולה. And a person who is known to be mishumad, in other words, who is regularly is involved in avodah zarah, is considered a mishumad l'chol Torah kula, not just with regards to one aspect of the Torah, because avodah zarah is the central pillar and tenet of the Torah, and you cannot adopt a certain position with regards to avodah zarah on the one hand, and claim that you believe in the Torah on the other hand. Rambam continues and says here in Halakha Taif, or part of Halakha Hey, V'chen haminim v'Yisrael. In other words, these are, as we mentioned, this refers to both over the Avodah Zarah, and this refers to atheists, people who reject the Torah out of hand. Enam ki-Yisrael davar min ad-devarim. They are not to be considered Jews for any purpose whatever. Enam ki-Yisrael davar min ad-devarim. Further, Rambam says, وَأَنْ مِقَبَّلِمْ أَثَمْ بِتْشُوفَةً لِعُلَامٍ. And we, here it's referring to the Jewish people, Jewish society, how do we relate to such a person? We do not accept them. We do not simply assume that if so-and-so says he's now about Teshuvah, we necessarily believe this to be the case. وَأَنْ مِقَبَّلِمْ أَثَمْ بِتْشُوفَةً لِعُلَامٍ شَنَيْمَارْ كَلْ بَأَهَا لَا يُشُوفُونَ وَلَا يَسِيغُوا أَرْحَوْ حَيِّمْ. This is a drasha of Rabbi Meir with regards to minim. In other words, those who are wrapped up in avodah zarah, it is almost without exception the case that they cannot remove themselves from such opinions, such ideas, such practices. So, kol ba'aha lo yishuvun. Once the person goes down that road, one can assume that they will not repent, they will not to make their way back. And Rambam here defines what he's referring to when he says minim. Wahaminim hem hatarim ahar machshavot libam besichluth. Minim are those who follow their hearts, their inclinations. They adopt intellectual positions and promulgate arguments with regards to such matters. Hem hatarim ahar machshavot libam besichluth bidvarim shamanu. People who adopt all kinds of positions and defend them, which are, of course, diametrically opposed to the Torah. Now, a person who really believes in that kind of philosophy, or theology, if you want to call it that, such a person will have no qualms at all about transgressing any and all aspects of the Torah, very deliberately. Bish'at b'nefesh, very deliberately, with disdain. That's the meaning of the word bish'at b'nefesh. B'yad ramah, and openly, publicly. The word b'yad ramah means, like the pasuk, Uvnei Yisrael yotha'im b'yad ramah. Yad ramah means la'en kol, without compunction, without fear, without trying to dissemble or hide it in any way. And they say, not only is it, do I say this or do this, I claim that it's completely without sin. It's not sinful or wrong in any way. And Rambam adds, one should not even speak to such people. It is not a good idea to try and convince them, to debate with them. To respond to them in any way. Shenemar al tikrav al petach betha. This is all in Sefer Mishneh, and it's all understood as I think is the simple, straightforward pshat of referring to minuth in general. Those first prakim of Sefer Mishneh discuss precisely minuth, which at that time was a common phenomenon in parts of the Jewish society, as it is today, as it was then. Again, nothing is new, and hadashta hadashamash. Umahshabeth min al-avodah zarah. And we assume always that a person who is known to be a min whatever he does, he has his intentions and his aims and his purposes are somehow wrapped up in his ideology, with his ideology. In other words, what is being said here by Rambam is that when a person has proved himself to be such an individual, even if it seems to us that outwardly we cannot obviously know, we cannot see what is inside a person's heart. So Hashem knows whether to accept him as a Baal Teshuvah or not, as Rambam just wrote at the end of Perek Shlishi of Hilchot Teshuvah that we just read. But we do not have that luxury. We do not have that ability to know what he really thinks or what he means, and whether he can be relied upon or not, whether we can trust him. So we have to be very, very wary of such people. Now, a person might say that today things are different because things are different for all kinds of reasons, and that is true. For example, as we just saw a moment ago, Rambam brought the statement of Rabbi Meir based on the pasuk in Mishneh, Perek Bet, Kol ba'er lo yishuvun. And such people do not change their ways, do not change their minds. That's almost always the case. That is true. And that's how it was in those days, because people acted as Jews who turned their back on the Torah in those days did so for specific ideological reasons, or in order to get ahead in some fashion, to be promoted or receive special consideration from the authorities, etc. And it makes no sense for such a person to do Teshuvah. Because that was your aim, that was your purpose. Why would you now backtrack? And so therefore, Kol ba'er lo yishuvun was a very correct and objectively realistic rule of thumb. However, as we know, over a period of many generations now, many Jews, for all kinds of reasons, were not brought up, were not educated in the ways of the Torah at all, or they grew up in a society. Perhaps next time I'll read to you from what the Chazon Ish writes about this. They grew up in surroundings, in a society, in an environment where it was normal and reasonable and standard practice to believe certain things or not to believe certain things. It wasn't really an ideological choice. It was just part of the course. And we also know that in more recent Jewish history, there has been a Teshuvah movement. There has been an historical reality which generally did not exist in previous times, as that's what we said before. Generally, if a Jew decided to convert to Christianity, shall we say, in the 12th century in Germany, and there were such cases, not very many, but there were, it was very, very rare indeed that such a person would repent and retract and wish to return to the Jewish community. And this is precisely the kind of reality that we're discussing here, that such a person could not be trusted, because it was almost universal truth that such people did not return, and such people could not be trusted. And it was also very rare, and it was not a product of the environment of Jewish society, of what was going on in that community. All the Jews, almost all the Jews, were loyal Jews, loyal to the Torah, who they, with the full heart, gave their allegiance to the Torah and to the Chachamim. And a Jew who turned his back on all of that was really an exceptionally evil individual. However, if in the fullness of time, Jews find themselves in various historical contexts in which many Jews are denied a Jewish education or the possibility of living as Jews, as happened, for example, in many parts of the world, but for example, Soviet Russia. So you had 3 or so generations of Jews, Soviet Russia and satellite states. You had many Jews who were brought up under this godless communist system, and that is the main aspect. That is the first and ultimate principle of communism, which is that there is no God. Has v'shalom. So this is the societal norm, and we understand why so many Jews ended up in that situation, and we can also understand why, in the wake of the Teshuvah movement that has began, as I understand it, in earnest in the wake of Milchemet Sheshet Hayomim, the 6-Day War, historically speaking. And because of the general breakdown of Western society in recent times, and the emptiness of current Western society, and the fact that people sense this emptiness and actually despair of society and of life in general. This is a fact throughout the world, essentially, to a large extent, certainly in the Western world. In that situation, if certain Jews find their way back to the Torah and do Teshuvah, because their original decision was not an ideological nor a deliberate decision, but the outcome of many factors, societal, historical, etc. It is much more likely that this person's Teshuvah is sincere and real, and therefore there might be room to amend this statement of Rambam and Chazal in the present situation. So I would definitely agree with that. On the other hand, I would also point out that there are people, some of whom are Ba'alei Teshuvah, and some of whom are FFBs from birth, who are very, very problematic and very to be regarded, looked at very much askance. Because on the one hand, they're ostensibly frum Jews, they keep Shabbat, and you find them in shul next to you and what have you. On the other hand, they are completely meshumad, in inverted commas, in the ideological sense. And they have adopted and incorporated within their being, within their world outlook, all manner of ideas which are completely false, misleading, spurious, and downright dangerous, lethally dangerous to the Jewish people and to themselves. And I think you can probably understand the kind of person that I'm referring to. So, when you find that there are certain so-called religious Jews in a place like Efrat, and I know I guarantee you that there are many other communities as well, but just using those as an example, and I happen to know of certain cases in that particular place, and I'm therefore not making this up. When you find that there are Jews who are ostensibly religious, but they actually support the so-called judicial apikoros dictatorship of the self-proclaimed president of the Supreme Court, Yitzhak Amit, and all his cronies, all his partners in crime. When you hear that these people support this group, and these people's claims, and do everything to undermine those who oppose them, then you understand that you are dealing with a very, very pernicious and very, very truly diseased mindset. I remember once, some years ago, I was at a certain home for a Shabbat meal, and I came into contact with such a person. And somehow the question of peace and land for peace and all these nonsensical discussions came up, and this person was he could easily have been. You could have easily have thought. You certainly would have been forgiven for thinking this person was a spokesman for Meretz or perhaps even Hamas. It was hard to know. Yet he had a kippah, and of course, when I made certain comments, he couldn't respond to anything I said intelligently. So what he did was he began to sing songs which involved somehow songs which included the word shalom. So he would start singing or says shalom b'murumav, all kinds of silly things, because obviously he had nothing intelligent to say. But this person was of a diseased mind, feeble mind, I would add as well. I wouldn't give him too many IQ points, and such people are extremely dangerous and have to be. And we have to apply this rule of en mekablim otam b'teshuvah with regards to such people, I think, because just as Rabbi Meir was stating about Avodah Zarah in his day, shekol ba'er lo yishuvun, thus such people who buy into the all these views and ideologies which are the opposite of Torah in every way. So these mindless, far leftist Jews, whether they wear a kippah or not, whether they eat kosher or not, and such people generally do not change their views. And even if they seem to indicate sometimes that they may have, you should be very wary and essentially be incredulous of such a claim. These people generally do not change their minds. And at best, they try and create some kind of amalgam of Torah and anti-Torah views. So that's like in the realm of physics, not that anyone knows that such a thing exists, but if there's something called antimatter, then it's like trying to mix matter and antimatter, in which case what happens according to the theory, when matter and antimatter come into contact, you end up with nothingness. You end up with nil, with zero. In other words, such an ideology cannot be maintained, it cannot be accepted, it cannot be defended. And such people in many ways are even more dangerous than the real apikorasim and the thoroughgoing minim and koferim, because with regards to such a person, this is who he is, this is what he says, and there's no ambiguity and there's no room for confusion. But with regards to such people, there is most definitely room for confusion. And some of such people are even known as rabbis, and they quote all kinds of sources to substantiate their views, their completely non-Torah views. And such people have to be completely ignored and lambasted, and they have to be exposed for what they are, which is enemies of Torah. So we shall end here for today. היו ברוכים, חזקו ואמץ לבבכם כל המייחלים לאדוני. שלום וניצחון. דוד מלך ישראל חי וקיים.